Well, hey there, duckies. Salwete, Anatīna. Oh, hello. As I walk around my homeland at Christmas time, I think about the original story of Christmas. But what is the actual biblical account? Let's explore that together. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. I've recently released a new audiobook on my Audiobooks store, The Biblical Christmas Story, and having done this, I've made a few observations about the text, the Latin and ancient Greek text, that I thought would be interesting to share. Something that I found interesting to find out exactly where the Christmas story is talked about. Well, it's talked about in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew only. That is, the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary, as well as the Nativity. And those are the only places that it's actually talked about. It's not a minor part of the New Testament, but it's not a particularly major part, which I found interesting growing up and finally doing some research and finding out, Christmas is very important, obviously, I would say, to Occidental culture in general, but the reasons for that may be a bit more to do with traditions inherited from the Roman Empire, such as the Saturnalia celebration and its importance, and how the importance of Christmas became associated with that ancient tradition, as well as many other ancient traditions which existed in the winter. Christmas, to outsiders, or even to me as a young child, seems like it's the most important holiday in Christianity, but in reality, of course, it's in fact Easter. Nevertheless, the story of Christmas is important in these two Gospels. Now, one could argue that many parts of the Bible point to the Nativity, but I decided to edit this text in the accompanying audiobook to include Luke 1:26 to 35, Luke 2:1 to 21, and Matthew 1:18 to 25. And that includes both the Annunciation and the Nativity. Now, thanks to the wonders of the internet, anyone can go and access these texts at Bible Hub or Bible Gateway, as well as many other places online. I decided for this arrangement to limit it to, of course, the original ancient Greek here on the right. Just so you know, ancient Greek includes the Koine Greek, which goes from the time of Alexander the Great all the way until the Byzantine Empire. That's still a part of ancient Greek literature, even though it's not classical. Some people have the misconception that ancient Greek means classical Greek, and that is not the case. Ancient Greek is the Greek found in antiquity, and that includes, of course, the time of the ancient Romans. The Latin text I took from the Jerome translation, and for the English, since I like old things, I decided to use the King James Version. In the actual audiobook, I recite the English in my normal American English pronunciation, although it might be fun to do it someday in the Shakespearean pronunciation, which would be, of course, contemporary with King James, or at least close enough to him. For the Latin, I did both classical and ecclesiastical pronunciations, and the Greek is recited, of course, in the Lucian pronunciation, and I recommend you see my video on the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek, which is a system of pronunciation based essentially on exactly this century, 1st century AD, the classical Roman time period when, of course, the New Testament was composed. So if you only listen to the classical Latin pronunciation and the ancient Greek, you will essentially be hearing the languages reconstructed in a way which I think comes reasonably close to the actual pronunciation of the languages when these events would have occurred. Of course, these two texts are separated by a few hundred years. The original Greek was composed in the 1st and perhaps the 2nd centuries, while the Latin translation happened 200 or 300 years later in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, which is when Jerome lived and made his tremendous translation of the entire Bible. So that means, of course, that the classical pronunciation of Latin, which pertains to the 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD, although it's appropriate for the events in the time period, it wouldn't be for, of course, Jerome, who lived hundreds of years later. No doubt his Latin pronunciation was considerably, or at least noticeably, different than that of his classical antecedents. Nevertheless, I like this text, and I wanted to recite it in this way. I also recited it in the ecclesiastical pronunciation for, I think, the obvious reason that it is, of course, a very well-known pronunciation, especially to those who have experienced the Latin Bible before. But I think it's very, very important to stress that the ecclesiastical pronunciation has nothing to do with Latin in antiquity. The ecclesiastical pronunciation was developed in the 9th century AD. So see my video about the immortal language to learn more about that. So 2 big misconceptions that I think are important to mention in all of this. One, that Koine Greek, or Kini Greek if you want to use the modern pronunciation, which is just fine. So Koine or Kini or Koine, or however you want to pronounce it, that Greek is a part of ancient Greek, and Biblical Greek is a subset of the Koine Greek. And the ecclesiastical pronunciation has nothing to do with the pronunciation of Latin during the Roman Empire. The classical pronunciation of Latin is absolutely much more accurate in general for any kind of native spoken Latin, whereas the ecclesiastical pronunciation is impossible for native spoken Latin. One of the biggest reasons is that a word like this, cogitabat, in the classical pronunciation, cogitabat in the ecclesiastical pronunciation, well, by the time that this G is becoming soft enough to be actually, well, first it would go through something more like ja before it becomes ja, cogitabat. Well, by the time that happens, a long time before, this letter B between vowels, the intervocalic B, had already become some kind of fricative, whether something like the intervocalic fricative of Spanish, ava, or like modern Italian, ava, or even into more of a semivowel, awa. It could have even merged with the W sound, as it has in, say, the languages of Corsican, as well as certain dialects of Italian, such as those found in Lazio, as well as some found in Campania. See my video about the pronunciation of the letter V in Latin to learn more about that. So the ecclesiastical pronunciation, this is actually a fantastic example, absolutely has nothing to do with antiquity because of this absurd asymmetry. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a wonderful pronunciation. I think it's very beautiful, and it's been around for a long time, so there's no reason not to appreciate it and utilize it if you like it. I, of course, like both of them, which is why I use both of them. A feature of ecclesiastical pronunciation that certainly was a part of antiquity as early as the 2nd century AD, we have attestations of the TI plus vowel becoming a TS sound. So something like salutatio could have been the pronunciation of at least some native speakers of Latin by the 2nd century. Other features, like the quae of classical Latin being pronounced que in ecclesiastical pronunciation, is fine because, as I mentioned in my AE Latin I video, the pronunciation of this changes to somewhere in the early part of the Roman Empire in the first few centuries for at least some speakers, and eventually that becomes the dominant pronunciation. But the asymmetry of this is going to be a G sound. Not only is going to be cogitavat, or probably even cogitava, which would make more sense actually, or even cogitava, where you have lenition here, the T becomes a D sound, the I becomes an so the E goes to S sound, cogitava, or something like that. Probably by then, this wouldn't even be que anymore, it would be just que. There are all kinds of different things that would have to occur in order to make the ecclesiastical pronunciation make sense. So there are things in ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation which can be found in antiquity, but of course an actual balanced native language pronunciation system is the classical pronunciation system. Again, this doesn't make the one superior to the other. It is simply a statement of fact. And if those facts interest you, they may guide your subjective preferences, but all such preferences are, of course, subjective. Now, something I particularly like about this is the utility as a pedagogical tool. Most people, if they're interested in both Latin and ancient Greek, will know Latin better in general, unless, of course, they're a native Greek speaker, in which case, of course, the ancient Greek would be more familiar to them for the fact of the alphabet, vocabulary, and, well, that's plenty. But most of the people in the world who study Latin and ancient Greek, most of which per capita I would say they're mostly in Italy as far as the actual course titles go. Thus, I think it's very useful to have these ancient translations of Greek into Latin as a very useful way to access ancient Greek and to learn the language better. And for the most part, the Jerome translation is almost word for word identical to the ancient Greek. Whatever the grammar and vocabulary of the 4th and 5th centuries in Latin could permit with respect to the ancient Greek is very directly represented here. So, for example, he onoma Nazaret, cui nomen Nazaret, it's almost word for word identical. In mense autem sexto, ende to meni to hecto. So here we see, hecto, sexto, autem. Where's that? Well, that's de. However, this means however, which is not represented at all in the English, which is interesting because it's just especially this ne is just sort of a particle thing in which Greek uses all the time, just because it's very fluid for the Greek speech. So in mense autem sexto, in de to meni to hecto. So we see the presence of the article, the word for the, which is in ancient Greek. Latin doesn't have the equivalent, thus it is, of course, not in the Latin. I find these comparisons really interesting. We see missus est, but here we have apestale, ho angelos. Now Latin, missus est, this is a past passive construction, right? Missus est. And then the Greek only has it as one word. But then we see angelos Gabriel, ho angelos Gabriel, aputu theou is polins, so a deo incivitatem. Here, very interesting, we see how polis, the word for city, is represented by civitas. This isn't particularly surprising because the literal English word city is from, of course, civitas, or civitas, if you want to use ecclesiastical pronunciation, compared, of course, to the word polis. Already by the time of Caesar, the word civitas was being used for cities and settlements. Its original meaning is something like citizenry, or even citizenship. This usage isn't particularly classical, but it does even occur already at that early period. Ad virginem desponsatem viro pros Parthenon, so viro, cui nomen erat Iosep, Andri ho nama Iosep, de domo David, ex oiko David. So down from the house of David. That's very interesting, I think, to see de instead of e, or some other preposition here. Already the use of de with greater frequency in later Latin is happening, which I find very interesting because, of course, the word e or ex does not survive into Romance, but some form of de does. So we can see that preferences of certain prepositions that just felt better in late Latin end up indicating where Latin as a language would go, as it split up, of course, into the Romance languages much later. Cat onomates parthenu variam, et nomen Virginis Maria. Wonderful to see this direct translation. I think this is a great way to study one language or the other, especially in this concert, which is why, of course, I made the audiobook for pedagogical reasons. Here's something lovely. Caeselthon, having entered, and ingressus, conveniently, the Latin can actually do that because the verb ingredior, ingredi, is a deponent verb. So its past participle is active, and we have an active participle as well here in the ancient Greek, which is pretty convenient. So this is rather clever use, because if it were a verb like inveniens, you could do it, but it would have to be present tense, and it would work, or you'd have to say et invenit Angulus et adeam dixit, something like that. So I think this is a very clever use. I think it's a very clever use of the deponent. This is, of course, why deponent verbs survived in Latin until such a late period, because they're really useful. You can get a lot of expressive capability out of them, even though they are asymmetrical, whereas most of the Greek forms are much more symmetrical, if you know what I'm talking about. If not, don't worry, just study Latin, study Greek, and you'll get the hang of it. Here in the original Greek, ho kyrios metasou Dominus tecum is well represented by that. But then, benedicta tu in mulieribus. This probably comes from some other text that Jerome had access to that ended up not being retained or not being regarded as canon for the ancient Greek, which is why it is missing here. But, of course, the English, blessed art thou among women, is retained from the Latin. So it's interesting how the King James Version is... I'd say it's a pretty lovely mix of the two. That's my opinion on it. Hutos estai megas, hicerit magnus. I love this. Word for word, direct translation. Kai huios hypsistu, filius et filius altissimi. Lovely, isn't it? Istus saionas, plural, but in aeternum, singular. So here we see the Latin idiomatic preference here is singular, whereas here it is plural. So I find that very interesting to see, because it indicates to me the translator, Jerome in this case, is not slavishly going word for word and keeping everything identical as if to gloss or calque everything, but is in fact using the idiom of his day. Now this I find particularly interesting. This is gignosko in ancient Greek in general, or of course in earlier forms of ancient Greek such as classical Greek. It would be spelled gamma iota, gamma, and then with the letter nu. So what we see here with the spelling of epsilon iota suggests probably that the fricative pronunciation of the gamma before the nu, because there was another gamma here, and it was just a single iota, a short one at that, it was lost due to the fricative nature of that consonant, and it became assimilated or lost entirely in front of the nu. And then we have, with the loss of that consonant, compensatory lengthening, because epsilon iota represents, for hundreds of years, at this point, the sound of E, the long E sound in ancient Greek. Single iota could do that too in certain words, but here it would be almost certainly long in duration. So, yinoshko. Where it was Ichnoshko. Now, these texts online don't have the same kind of editing. That is, the macrons, I added all these myself because that's where the long vowels are. And naturally, ancient Greek has long vowels as well, which need to be marked. And I have added all those here in my version. I just love seeing Caesare Augusto and Caesaros Augustu. They're just they're just so similar, and because I find these Latin terms are just so familiar from. It was very early when I heard terms like Caesar Augustus. So then, of course, the Latin, which I'm very familiar with, and then seeing the Caesaros Augustu, it's lovely. It makes me really excited to see this kind of thing because, of course, I know Latin better than ancient Greek, and I know this ancient Greek text reasonably well. But nevertheless, I still find it very exciting to be like, oh look, I know him, and I know him, and I still know him. This is great.
I understood that reference.
So the Bible can be a really useful way to study languages. Now, this is something I wanted most to talk about because here we see that Cyrenius, right? Kyrenios would be how it is. Kyreniu in the genitive case here, the possessive version. Kyrenios. Modern Greek would be Kyrenios, or Kyrenios, probably is how modern Greek would say it, because the letter eta in modern Greek, if you didn't know, is pronounced E, just like the iota is pronounced E. So this would sound something like Kyrenios, because of course the upsilon is also E, so Kyrenios. Is something like that would be the modern Greek pronunciation of the name. But in antiquity, certainly in the 1st and or 2nd century AD, when this very thing was composed, it would be, this word here would be Kyreniu, so we have an U, and then we have the E sound. The sound of eta, of the letter eta in modern Greek, this, in English we call it eta, by the way. Greeks, if you're listening, that's just the name of it, eta. That's the name of the letter, because that's how it has to be pronounced in English. It's called phonotactics. Look it up. So the letter eta, when it was adopted into the Attic alphabet, which was in 403 BC by the archon Euclid, certainly represented a more open sound, because the epsilon iota, here's an example of it, this epsilon iota here in the late 5th century was pronounced as a high closed E sound, while the letter eta was pronounced as an open sound. Now the quality difference is important, but they're equal in length. This is long this is long E in classical ancient Greek in the 5th century BC. But very soon after, by the late 4th century, before consonants, this is already closing to E, and then this sound is probably not very open anymore. It's probably becoming a little bit more true mid, kind of like Spanish, or even modern Greek sound of epsilon. So the way this sounds, instead of being a sound of such as in the Italian word caffè or il tè, so instead of being very open in quality, it's probably just floating to something more mid like but always long, while this is close to E. So for an authentic pronunciation in the first couple centuries AD, this certainly would be kyreniu, some kind of or even maybe a high closed E would be fine, but not E yet. So what's going on here? Why then is the Latin being pronounced E? Why is it kyrino? That's so odd, isn't it? Well, not necessarily, because this is from the 4th and 5th century, right? This is from Jerome. By then, the eta probably had closed, certainly for the ear of our friend Jerome, who translated it. He would have probably read this as something like kyriniu. Byzantine pronunciation tends to preserve this U sound for a bit longer, so it makes sense that in late antiquity this would still, of course, be preserved here as an U, while this would become E. Another observation I made while recording this, look how Bethlehem, here in the ancient Greek, but Bethlehem, there's an H here. The H is etymological to a sound of the Hebrew or Aramaic of the time, so something like Hem probably would be the sound of the city for this word, yet it's not represented in the Greek. Well, does that mean the Greeks would have even thought to say Bethlehem if they had the education? Would they have added an internal aspiration? Is this aspiration here in Latin just because Latin has no problem with H's in the middle of words and ancient Greek spelling just doesn't support it? So these are interesting questions. Maybe it was pronounced natively, maybe it wasn't. In any case, it's just an interesting curiosity. One more comparison observation, kognoskebat, egi nosken. Here I've made this a long iota because this is another case of compensatory lengthening, or it certainly would be if this author retained phonemic vowel length, which is, of course, standard for ancient Greek well into the 4th century AD. So here there should be another gamma, but it's lost. And similarly, as we saw above with the epsilon iota, representing a long E sound, iota on its own could also represent the long E sound. And that is simply another example of the changing pronunciation of ancient Greek. Also look at this, et accepit conjugem suam, his own. But here we have autou, because already, pretty commonly for biblical Greek, the one's own, the he autou, that would be his own, that little he particle tends to go away, which is interesting as a development. Even though ancient Greek is, of course, an older language, it goes through its own natural changes. So by the 1st century AD, he autou is a little old-fashioned, perhaps, a little stilted, whereas autou does all the work, much as it does in English. And took unto him his wife. To say his own wife isn't really necessary, even in English of hundreds of years ago, just as it wasn't in ancient Greek. But the Latin suam is utterly critical. This difference between suam and eius is clear and maintained even in Latin, late Latin literature. So I find that very, very interesting that this kind of clarity between suam and eius, which does not survive into the Romance languages, apparently wasn't yet archaic in the writing style of Jerome, which is why he used it in the late Latin period, while, of course, the older form of Greek had already lost that kind of distinction, though it used to have it. Fascinating stuff. I hope you enjoyed this little review of where the biblical texts that have to do with Christmas actually come from. Like I said, if you're interested, I have recorded all these texts, English, Latin, in both pronunciations, as well as the ancient Greek text as an audiobook that you can get on my audiobook store if you want to support the channel. It's a great way, and I think it's a really interesting and useful pedagogical tool to listen to these languages spoken. You can listen to the English, and then you can listen to the Latin in either pronunciation, and then to the ancient Greek as a way to kind of familiarize yourself. I'm assuming you know English pretty well since you're listening to all of this. Familiarize yourself with the story by listening to it in English, reading along if you like, then listening to the Latin pronunciation of your choice to exercise your Latin and improve your Latin. If you're just studying Latin and the Greek isn't really for you yet, well, the Latin text and audio is going to be very helpful as you learn the Latin language. Once you get to about chapter 28 in Familia Romana, you're already reading biblical texts, so this should be relatively straightforward for you at that point. And then finally, the ancient Greek. So if you are pretty good at Latin or okay at Latin, and then you're trying to familiarize yourself with ancient Greek, that is the order I recommend. Listening to the English, then listening to the Latin, and then listening to the ancient Greek. And if you do that a little bit each day, even with just this text or with my other, which is the trilingual Gospel of John. Actually, I have 3 now of these trilingual things on my audiobook store. I think this is a really great way to familiarize yourself with what's going on, get your Latin going, and sort of get into the mindset of this more sophisticated, shall we say, grammatical kind of language, these classical languages with Latin, which is quote-unquote easier for most people, and then to the ancient Greek. That is what I recommend. Also, if you're interested, I'll be reading selections of this in a live stream on my other channel, Scorpio Martianus, on Christmas Eve. So if you want to have a listen to that, I will invite you to come and check out that live stream. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much for listening and for watching and for subscribing and sharing. If you celebrate Christmas, I wish you a very Merry Christmas. Valete, erros the.